The theme of this seminar is information resources in British heritage collections. So I'll structure this talk around the groups of relevant works as they're organised at the RBG. The herbarium, archives, printed books, then ending with illustrations. It sounds a bit prosaic, but I hope there are enough interconnections to make some sort of narrative, and there will be interconnections with the two talks that we've already heard. First, it's necessary to say something about the history of the Botanic Garden and the development of these collections. The garden was founded in 1670, primarily as a teaching institution and with a medical focus. It was jointly administered by the Crown and by the Town Council of Edinburgh, which ran the university. Pure botanical research in the modern sense really developed only from the late 19th century, with the notable exception of a period during the Scottish Enlightenment under John Hope. Until the mid-19th century, the collections, the library, the dried herbarium specimens, and even the plants in the garden were the personal property of the Regius Keeper of the garden, who was also the professor of botany at the university. So when he died or retired, the collections were lost to the garden. But from around 1860, it effectively became a national collection with increasing funding from the central government. Whilst private ownership led to loss and lack of continuity in terms of material culture, so too did the government administration, with much archival material disappearing into the black hole of sponsoring departments. The result is far fewer archives than might be expected for a 350-year-old establishment. Nevertheless, from the mid-19th century, a very significant library and herbarium has developed, to which older material has been gradually added. The herbarium is the core collection of the Botanic Garden, with some 3 million specimens from all over the world, covering flowering and non-flowering plants and fungi. And no fewer than 500,000 of these specimens come from India, collected by at least 250 individuals, dating between 1700 and 1996. So as a reminder of colonial beginnings, here is a specimen of the black pepper. It's an astonishing 322 years old. It can also be used to show how to read a specimen. First, at the bottom of the sheet, the collecting details collected by Daniel Dubois on the Malabar coast and sent by him to his brother Charles Dubois, who was treasurer of the East India Company, who amassed a big herbarium. It also bears references to earlier printed publications, the Hortus Malabaricus, and it includes a local Malayalam name in the middle there. Some of the information is a bit cryptic. The CB, for example, stands for Caspar Bauhaus, Swiss botanist, Pinax Theatri Botanici of 1623. And what about the subsequent history and how the specimen comes to be at Edinburgh? On his death, Charles Dubois left 80 bound volumes of his herbarium to Oxford University, but these in the late 19th century were dismembered, with duplicates sent to other institutions, including Edinburgh. As a reminder of the intimate link between medicine and botany, and the Botanic Garden's teaching role, here's a rather wonderful specimen of the opium poppy. Was used in the mid-19th century. Curator of the garden's lectures, James McNabb, was the head of the horticultural side of the garden, and rather than so it was used by him rather than John Hutton Balfour, his boss, who was the academic professor. It's also a reminder of the shadow side of the East India Company and its ruthless trading activities. Opium famously was grown in India and shipped to China to pay for tea, with disastrous consequences. But this specimen was actually grown in Edinburgh from seed sent from the company's own opium factory at Ghazipur in Bihar. The factory still exists, occupying an extraordinary 43 acres, its security broken only by a troop of junkie monkeys. With this specimen of Strobilanthes, we move from the commercialization of botany to its pursuit as an intellectual activity. The major ethos behind the herbarium, its role in taxonomic research and the documentation of biodiversity. Many of the Edinburgh-trained medics working for the East India Company made valuable herbaria. They, of course, were all men, but this one was made by a colonial wife, Christian Countess of Dalhousie, the wife of the commander-in-chief of the company's army. She made it on a visit to Shimla in 1831, and she presented her herbarium to the Botanical Society of Edinburgh on her return, and this collection was one of the foundations of the Botanic Gardens herbarium. Here you can see some more revealing annotations. The CBD at the bottom left, for example, doesn't stand for Convention of Biological Diversity, but for Christian Brown Dalhousie. Pencil note bottom right by my colleague David Long records that the Swiss botanist de Candolle cited it as the type, the original voucher specimen of a new species, Strobilanthes elatus. The determination sticker at the top left shows that this specimen was used in the Flora of Bhutan project, for which John Wood wrote the family Acanthaceae, to which this genus belongs. And the specimen that you can see bottom left was scanned for the Melon project, by which all the types in the herbarium were made available for use worldwide on the web, linked by means of the barcode to the Gardens database. Although I've explained why the archives aren't as extensive as perhaps expected, there's nevertheless a large and rich body of material relating to India. Training of medical students started, as I said, in 1670, but for an Indian context, it became particularly important under Professor John Hope between 1760 and 1786, and under his successors, Daniel Rutherford, Robert Graham, and John Hutton Balfour up till around 1880. No fewer than 30 of Hope's students joined the East India Company as surgeons. This bound manuscript has an extraordinary history. We already heard from Isabel about Francis Buchanan, and these notes were taken from Hope's lectures in 1781 by Buchanan, confusingly later called Hamilton. He was one of the greatest naturalists ever to work in India, these notes are important not only as a record of Hope's teaching, especially his taxonomic views, but also on the relations between plants and the environment. He early on taught the work of Priestley and Ingenhouts, but they're also important as an artifact. The notes were lent by Buchanan to his shipmate, Alexander Boiswell, on an outward journey to India in 1785, but Boiswell lost them at the Battle of Satamangalam in 1790 during the Third Mysore War. They were taken as loot by Tipu, who had them bound for his library. When that in turn was looted after the Battle of Seringapatam, the volume was retrieved by Major David Ogg and returned to Buchanan, who happened to be surveying Mysore for Richard Wellesley in 1800. In the 1950s, the volume was sold with the contents of Buchanan's house, Lenny, and found by the RBG librarian in a second-hand bookshop in Edinburgh in 1966. Particularly rich in Indian material is the incoming correspondence of John Hutton Balfour from the mid-19th century. It includes 170 letters from 29 of his former students who worked in India, and gives an insight into their life and work. I used it at 82 from Hugh Cleghorn when writing Cleghorn's biography. In the letters, surprisingly little botany, though there is something about donations to the herbarium and to Balfour's Museum of Economic Botany, which sadly was destroyed in the 1960s. But that's a different story. Much of the letters are devoted to missionary activity and to the recruitment of Scottish gardeners for Indian governmental botanic gardens. But everyone likes Darwin, so here's a letter from him that does have an indirect Indian link with the mention of John Scott at the bottom of the page. As a junior gardener at the Botanic Garden in Edinburgh, Scott did pioneering hybridization experiments on primulas, the subject of this letter. but this incurred the jealousy of his bosses. He was acting above his station. So Darwin and Hooker paid for his fare to a job as a curator of the Calcutta Botanic Garden, where his most famous exploit was to save a fellow member of staff from the jaws of an escaped tiger from the king of Awad's menagerie that had swum across the Hooghly. But it all ended badly as Scott caught malaria whilst working on opium in the Gangetic Plain. He came home to die at the age of only 22. To represent the 20th century and to show one of my favourite documents, I need to broaden the definition of Indian rather northwards to include Tibet. Joseph Hooker's rhododendron discoveries in Sikkim in 1848 changed the face of British gardens, after which China and the Himalayas became a major source of horticultural riches. As collectors, none were greater than Frank Ludlow, a teacher, and Major George Sheriff, a soldier, with both doubtless intelligence gatherers on the side. And their series of outstanding expeditions in the 30s and 40s were to Bhutan and Tibet. This is the passport or lanyard for their penultimate expedition to Southeast Tibet in 1946, which instructs local headmen to provide transport and food at set rates, and the explorers are told not to shoot animals on sacred land or to mistreat their Tibetan servants. The most important botanical library north of Oxbridge is rich in Indian printed material, periodicals, monographs, and floras. The earliest that relates to India is Clusius's Aliquot Notae and Garciae Aromatum Historiam of 1582, which includes woodcuts both of the banyan and of the betel palm. But much more significant is the Hortus Malabaricus of Henrik van Rede. He was the Dutch commandant of Malabar, based in Cochin, where he assembled a team of Indian physicians, plant collectors and translators, and Dutch artists to record the plants of the west coast of India. The materials were sent to Amsterdam, where between 1678 and 1693, 12 spectacular volumes were edited by a series of Dutch botanists and the plates engraved. It's one of the key early tropical floristic works, and many new species were based on its plates by Linnaeus and subsequent botanists. This is the frontispiece of the single volume that John Hope owned, which was doubtless shown to his students as an inspiration. The Botanic Garden later acquired the first 6 volumes from Hugh Cleghorn's collection, but sadly we still don't have the second 6. To represent the 18th century, when a more systematic recording of the India flora began, here is a plate from the plants of the Coromandel Coast by William Roxburgh. The exploration by Western botanists, Indians of course had long had their own systems of classification and naming, began in the south with men such as Johann Koenig, who we heard about from Isabel, a pupil of Linnaeus. Hope's pupil Roxburgh went to Madras in 1776, and following James Kerr, employed artists to make illustrations to supplement his written descriptions. This continued after his transfer as superintendent of Calcutta Botanic Garden in 1793, and he eventually had drawings of some 2,500 Indian species. One of the sets of drawings was sent to London, from which Sir Joseph Banks supervised the engraving and printing of 300 of them, between 1795 and 1820, in 3 sumptuous double elephant volumes. Engraving was a very expensive process, and from the 1820s, lithography took over as a cheaper way of reproducing not only illustrations, but manuscript. This is the numerical list of dried specimens of plants in the East India Company's museum, which is a spectacular example of the use of lithography. The Dane Nathaniel Wallace succeeded Roxburgh and ran the Calcutta Garden from 1817 to 1846. He continued the tradition of employing artists who made some of the most beautiful botanical drawings ever, but he vastly extended the project of documenting the flora of South and Southeast Asia by means of a network of collectors. In 1828, he went to London on leave, taking 1,500 drawings and 20 tons of herbarium specimens. There in Frith Street in Soho, with help from other botanists, he curated and identified these, which amounted to 21,000 individual collections, representing about 9,000 species. The top set of specimens listed in this work, what's known as to botanists, the Waller catalogue, was left in London, and the specimens are still at Kew. But 64 partial sets of duplicates were sent to botanists in Britain, Europe, and America, and 4 of these have ended up in the Edinburgh Herbarium. My own special interest since 2000 has been the history of the Botanic Gardens Indian collections, in particular the botanical drawings, and the light these can shed both on commissioners and the Indian artists who made them. But I'll start with a different medium, photography. The relation between taxonomic botany and photography has never been as strong as people seem to expect. Until very recent digital advances, its results have never come close to approaching the value of good illustrations. There are rather few Indian-related photographs in the Edinburgh collection, but those we have are of great interest. These ones were taken by Roland Edgar Cooper, a horticulturist who made important collections in Sikkim in 1913, where these were taken, and in Bhutan in 1914 and 15. Perhaps as a gardener of lower status than the likes of Hooker and Ludlow Sheriff, he actually recorded not only the name of his Indian assistants, but the appearance of this one, Romu, on whom the whole enterprise of plant collecting documentation ultimately depended. Romu was a lecturer, the group who were the original inhabitants of Sikkim, whose animism and respect for nature made them particularly good plant collectors. But to turn to drawings, the first of the Scottish surgeons to use the talents of Indian artists was James Kerr. Although they were not accustomed to drawing naturalistically by tradition, the artists proved able to do so easily when shown Western examples as models and supervised in techniques such as the use of a simple lens for the floral details. So on the left is the legume Codaria Calyx motorius, whose leaves make strange twitching movements. Kerr sent this to his teacher John Hope around 1774. And on the right, another legume, the rosary pea, with its very poisonous seeds. This is from an album that came to the Botanic Garden with the collection of the great economic botanist Sir George Watt. It long defied identification, but I eventually showed that it was also commissioned by James Kerr. From a different tradition altogether is a vast tome on the grasses of Assam. Many Westerners in India, particularly women, made paintings of natural history subjects. Samuel Peel had trained as an artist in England, but in 1862 went out to Assam as a tea planter, where he had a particular interest in the diseases of tea and in grasses. He painted those of his own estate at Sibsagar. A friend of his, James Foster, a surgeon, decided to make a facsimile of the drawings in case of accident, and he must have been prescient, as Peel's bungalow burnt down with the loss of all his collections. So this facsimile copy of his accurate and delicate drawings is the only record that survived. But to return to the work of Indian artists, and Hugh Cleghorn, who was the largest single provider of Indian material in the Botanic Gardens collections, if largely indirectly. These consist of herbarium specimens, printed books, letters, and botanical drawings. He'd studied at the garden under Robert Graham and went to Madras, where he'd actually been born, in 1842. Following the tradition of Roxburgh, he made extensive use of Indian artists, which started when he was posted to a place called Shimoga in the Kingdom of Mysore, where he employed, but sadly did not name, what he called a Marathi artist, probably one of the craftsmen known there as Gudigars. The artists hardly ever signed their work, though often left traces, such as the Kannada name, at the top left here of this picture of the sacred lotus, one of the most beautiful of his drawings. After this period, Cleghorn returned to Madras and became better known as a forest conservator. When he died in 1890, his herbarium came to the Botanic Garden, but his important collection of books and 3,000 drawings went to the Royal Scottish Museum and came to the Botanic Garden only in 1938. But such fragmentation and dispersal of collections is a common theme, as for example in the appalling history of the company's own India Museum. I'll end with one of my favourite drawings of the flamboyant Delaunix Regia, painted in the Depury Botanic Garden of the Bombay Presidency around 1848 by an unnamed Indo-Portuguese artist for the Scottish surgeon Alexander Gibson. This is representative of the transfer of plants through the international network of botanic gardens. It had only recently been introduced via Mauritius from Madagascar. As is usual with the collections of botanical drawings in institutions such as Edinburgh and Kew, there is no associated documentation, in this case not even the garden in which it had been made, but research opened up the way to investigate the life of Gibson as a pioneering forest conservator, which meant visiting archives in Mumbai and London. In my work, I've also tried to foreground the unsung skills of the artists who made a major contribution to the taxonomic work of their Western bosses. Well, that's the end. It's only been possible to give here a glimpse of Edinburgh's rich Indian collections, but I hope that it's shown something of their range and something of the uses to which they can be put. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Henry. That's a tremendous introduction to the very extensive and important and beautiful collections at the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh. I'm mindful we may have quite a lot of questions coming in, although I do hope I haven't given a kiss of death to Q&A. But I would like to thank you again for agreeing to speak at short notice. It's been marvellous to have you as part of our panel today. And so if people do have questions, please feel free to put them into the Q&A. I have a question which I'm afraid is tangential, and I do wonder. It could be very easily be a talk in and of itself. So do feel free to say no if you don't really want to answer. But I'm very curious to. If you could, I'd be very interested to know if you could speak briefly to the question of how, to what extent plants, the Indian plants and collections were actually used in Western medicine from in the periods during and after the ones we're discussing.
I'm not the best person to ask about medicinal plants, but the point to remember is that these people who really did the pioneering work on documenting the flora of India from a Western point of view were all trained as medics. The only way to get a knowledge of botany was through the botany was part of the medical faculty, and to do a doctorate in medicine you had to study botany. So they went out as medics, but because they had this nearest thing to a scientific training, a lot of them were interested, they'd also studied wider natural history through people like John Walker and Robert Jameson in Edinburgh. And the company, they were sort of playing a double game. The company, obviously wanted them to treat their troops and keep them healthy. And so they were interested in local uses, medicinal uses, and two of them, for example, made major works collecting information on indigenous uses of plants. Well, I've got, I mean, Van Reyder started in the 17th century. I mean, a lot of his information was collected from local medical traditions, but in the British period, there were two people, particularly John Fleming in Bengal, also commissioner of a remarkable series of botanical and zoological drawings. He wrote a account of the medicinal plants of Bengal, and in South India, Whitelaw Ainslie and other people of John Hope wrote a much more substantial Materia Medica of Hindustan. And they some of them probably did use indigenous plants to treat. There were odd papers. I mean, James Kerr wrote a paper on the use of one of the cassia species in treating ringworm, but basically they were still using Western medicine, but for things like senna, they were trying to grow it locally rather than having to import it, which was more expensive. But no, there's not a huge amount of evidence that they got seriously into using indigenous medicines.
Thank you very much, Henry. I see Isabel has her hand up if she'd like to ask a question.
Yeah, this is a bit of an unformed thought that so bear with me. I'm struck by the fact that the Linnean Society collections, when Holly was speaking, and RGBE, we all have examples of how Indian artists had to adapt to Western styles of depicting a plant or an animal, and I'm very conscious of why that is. It was because they had to follow, a kind of a, or it was adapted in order to respond to scientific descriptions. But I wonder if there are any examples of, and I'm also conscious that at the same time throughout the 19th century, you've got collectors of more traditional Indian art. But I'm struck by the fact that we don't find that more traditional Indian art in our collections, that everything has been adapted for Western use, if you see what I mean. Is that a naive thought?
No, true. It's true, but we just saw 3 spectacular examples in Holly's presentation. I mean, those very stylized pictures of the date palm, the palmyra, and the Bodhi tree, which, I mean, who would have recognized that as a ficus? And I mean, the question of that miniature foreground, I mean, that is very typical of paintings made in places like Patna and Lucknow. And I mean, her 3 artists, of the little statement at the bottom of the IMPI pages says that those 3 artists were natives of Azimabad, the old name for Patna. But the only other example I've ever come across of really traditional type Indian paintings is from South India in the Natural History Museum. There's an astonishing little volume made probably in the 1780s, 90s, of what are called tanjore grains, the different legumes and cereal plants grown in South India, which are painted in really thick gouache and with coloured backgrounds. I mean, the Western botanists, they didn't want backgrounds, they wanted the specimen isolated in a sea of white. But that tanjore volume is extraordinary. And the way it's mounted too is in a traditional Indian way, unpainted background. But no, it is very rare for the more Indian side of the artist's background to reveal itself in these drawings. But they were adapting to new commissioners and doing what they wanted.
I suppose just to add to that, what we're looking at here often is material that's been produced within a scientific context, using with an empirical or empiricist. But approach. Of course, within the Royal Asiatic Society collections, we have drawings of this nature, and the William Jones, Lady Jones and Shea Chaldean collection. And we also have very large collections of Indian painting, including by Indian artists and within traditional Indian styles, and indeed other parts of Asia, which do depict plants and animals within a different context, within a different tradition, where it's not depicted in a scientific or quasi-scientific fashion, but either from a religious context or historical or mythological or other. So I suppose the point is to be mindful of that diversity of forms of presentation, and of course those kinds of genres could also be presented within Western styles as well, but the prevailing one, I suppose, particularly when we're looking at botany, and I suppose we'll see it to an extent with animal depictions as well, is that the scientific mode, particularly because of the kinds of economic and other purposes to which it was intended to be applied. But that's just only sort of an initial sort of thought. Do we have any other questions or comments, or perhaps you'd want to come back on that? If we don't have any more questions or contributions now, perhaps we might have them later on. But we're scheduled for another break. So if people would like to take a few minutes, and I would just like to thank Henry once again for wonderful talk, and again for coming in at late notice. And we will otherwise be back in just over 5 minutes, by 10 past, for the next presentation, which will be Anne Sill from the Zoological Society of London on animals of Asia. Thank you all very much.